Hello guys, now we are going to look at the second game in the queenside pawn majority, and the beauty of this game's character changes after the middle game into a knight versus bad bishop ending. So let's see how the game goes. It is played between Botvinnik and Konstantino Polski in 1943. It's a Caro-Kann defense. It is similar to the first game which I have posted, and here black somehow manages to defend the position, but it ends up in a a good knight for white and a bad bishop for black. And let's see the game: e4, c6, d4, d5, ed5, cd5, and c4, knight f6. Knight c3, knight c6, bishop g5, e6, knight f3, bishop e7, rook c1, castle shot, and c5, knight e4, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop e2, bishop to d7, and a3. White's plan is to secure his pawn formation on the queen side, obtaining command of the squares c6 and if possible c7 as well. Then advance with b5 and c6. During these operations, the e5 square acquires a special significance, for a knight posted there adds to white's command of c6. So the further course of game is easy to understand. Now black goes f5, and here this move is weakening e5 and thus playing into his opponent's hand. Here correct was f6, and after f6 it's b4. Now knight takes c3, and after rook takes c3, now a6, and after castling, then rook a d8, with the object of eventually pushing e5 to obtain counterplay and a possible passed d pawn as compensation for white's queenside majority. So, but black went for f5. Now bishop to b5. It is often essential to act quickly. This move threatens bishop takes c6 followed by knight to e5 and a gradual exploitation of his majority, as black is practically powerless because of the solid position of white's knight at e5. Now knight to g5. This cuts across white's intention to occupy e5 with the knight, but at the cost of submitting to another drawback. After bishop takes c6, now knight takes f3, queen takes f3, b takes c6, and queen f4, rook a e8, and castle shot, and e5. The only way in which black can get rid of his backward pawn. Now queen takes, d takes, rook takes. The fight has assumed entirely a different character. Certainly white's pawn majority is still being, but black's protected passed d pawn is no less valuable an asset. However, white has secured a fresh advantage. He has a good knight against black's bad bishop. The bishop is bad because the black pawns stand on the same color squares, and its mobility is thereby strictly limited. The knight is strong because sooner or later it will be able to reach d4, where it will be secured from both the enemy pawns and bishop. So let's see how the game continued. and white's pawn majority on the queen side has lost its significance. The fact that white can obtain a passed c-pawn after a4 and b5 is certainly of no greater importance than the fact that black already has a passed pawn at d5. Uh, and Here, if at all the pawn is not at f5, the bishop value would increase, but the f5 pawn is a great hindering piece. So in order to keep the bishop as bad as possible, the pawns must be not allowed to leave their respective squares. So here the important move is f4, and after f4 now rook e7, and then here rook fe1. An exchange of rooks increases the superiority of the knight over the bad bishop. Now rook f e8. So black cannot give up the open file because white's rooks would penetrate. Now rook takes e7, rook takes e7, king f2, and this move aims to exchange the second rook as well, after which the ending will be one for white. Here let's see, if at all black takes the route of bishop c8 then to a6 and c4, what will happen. And the game might go like bishop to c8, and then rook to e1, rook takes, king takes, and bishop to a6, and now b3, and now king to f7, king to d2, king to e6, king to e3, and now bishop to f1, g3, g6, and king to d4. Up to now, the moves on either side were by no means forced. It would and it would lead us too far afield to understand a detailed investigation of the tangle of possible complications. Our main object is to give an idea of the winning chances without paying too much attention to the finessing and detail. The black pawn structure is now fixed, mainly on account of the strong position of white's king, but the bishop has escaped outside its own pawn chains and is not hindered by them to the same extent as before. The drawback of the bad bishop is now indirect and is based on the fact that all the black pawns as well as the bishop occupy light squares, so that the dark squares are vulnerable and can easily fall into white's control. Moreover, the white pawns cannot be attacked by the bishop. The important squares at d4 is already occupied by white, and black's king must keep guard over e5. Black cannot undertake anything and must remain on the defensive. On the other hand, what is there for white? From b4, the white knight can attack the c pawn. which cannot be defended by bishop b5 because of a4. On the other hand, if the king guards the pawn by going king to d7, the way to black's kingside pawn is free via e5, f6 and g7. It follows that black is reasonably enough must try to prevent knight b4 by a5. But then white has the opportunity of obtaining a passed a pawn by pushing b4. An early advance of b4 appears quite normal move, but actually severely reduces white's chances. So let's see that in the the game might have gone in two types. The first one is bishop to a6, bishop to a6, after bishop to a6, now knight to a2, and bishop to e2, and now knight to b4, and now king to d7, and now the king enters the king side, and now bishop to d1 and king to f6, and bishop takes b3 and king to g7 and a5, knight to d3 and king to e6 and knight to e5, now d4, now knight takes c6, king to d5, knight takes d4, king takes d4, now c6, a4, now a4, and after c7, then bishop to e6, then king takes h7, king c3, king takes g6, king b3, now h4, king takes a3 and h5, king to b3, h6, a3, h7 and a2, now h8, pawn to h8, and it's winning for white. If at all bishop e6 before a4, then king takes h7, king d5, c7, king d6, now king takes g6, this, it's a waste of time, I think. So anyways, black is lost. So this is the first kind of thing. If at all the king goes to d7, Then the king enters, the white king enters with king e5. So this was the first plan for white. And next, let's see another kind of play. If at all, instead the bishop going to a6, if black plays pawn to a6, I mean I'm sorry, pawn to a5. If he plays pawn to a5, then there will be a knight to a2 and bishop e2 and b4, a b4, here bishop to c4, then b takes a5, and if at all a4 is played, then simply knight c3, and if it is played, and white will push the c pawn and the king will go to c5. Okay, so here taking the pawn was correct. After a b4, now knight takes b4, now bishop to b5 and knight to a2 and bishop to c4, knight to c3, bishop to a6, now a4, bishop to f1 and knight to a2 and bishop to c4, now knight to b4, now king to d7, now king to e5, king c7, king f6, and then d4, king g7, and d3. Now the knight is given after bishop takes. Now h4, h4. If at all king takes h7, then there will be g5. h4, bishop to e2, king takes, bishop h5, g7. Anyways, white is winning, I think. Because he has h5 and gh5. Now this is going to d4, takes e5, 3. Here instead of h4, king takes h7 is shown as good for white, and then after king d7, king takes, king e7, bishop e2, and then h4, king, okay, a5. Now white is winning. Now white is easily winning. So I showed all these moves to illustrate how the ending would be after the move bishop to c8, which we looked the game goes like this. So but then in the game, I mean in the game, the black player didn't go bishop to c8, as he knew that would also lose. He went for king f7, and this is a cunning move. And should white nevertheless play for an exchange of rooks, failure will await him. Here, if at all rook to e1, then after rook takes e1, king takes e1, then there's d4, and after knight e2, there is king to e6. Now knight takes d4, now king to d5, and black wins back his pawn with a satisfactory position. The blockade is lifted and all danger is past. Generally speaking, it can be stated that black can save the game if he can play d4 without immediate fatal consequences. So if black could safely move d4, he can easily counter white and win the game. So white should not exchange the rooks here. So after king f7, white went rook d1, now forcing black pawns to remain on the light squares. Now rook e8. It is impossible to bring the bishop into open without making some concession. For example, if at all bishop c8 is played, then knight to e2, then g6, then knight to d4, rook to c7, and now the rook is paralyzed. So after rook e8, now rook to d2, now h6, rook e2, rook b8, here the rooks, if at all exchange, the knight would control the d4 square, which is the key for winning the game for black. So he avoided the exchange and he went rook b8. Now king e3. Here b4 is more obvious. But there are two objections for this move. After eventually exchanging the rooks, white can no longer play knight a2 and knight to b4, and more important still, he has no further opportunity to obtain a passed pawn. Black can start a counter action with a5. So b4 was not played. So now king e3, then rook b3. Black tries to fix the queenside pawns, but it is only temporary. Now king d4. The king has reached the desired strong point and already threatens king to e5 and to d6. And now king f6. Now knight to a2, rook to b8. Here after a5 there follows knight to c1, and after rook to b8 there is b3, and sooner or later b4 will follow. So rook to b8, now b4. This is the crucial moment, for with this move white forgoes the opportunity to carry out the maneuver of knight a2 to knight b4, so that the ending knight versus bishop assumes a different aspect now. Now g5, and let us investigate the alternative. Here a5 would play into white's hands after b takes a5. If at all, now rook to b3, then knight to c3, rook takes a3, then rook to a2. So then computer shows this. If at all this, then rook to a2 is coming. The same idea. And if at all rook a8, then knight to c3, then rook takes a5 and a4, and this gives white a strong passed pawn. All this because of the a5 move by black. If at all now rook e8 is played, then after rook takes e8, bishop takes e8. Now a4 by white. Here b5 is a mistake, because after cb5 king takes d5. There is bishop to f7 check. There is a small tactic here. So after a4 and if a6, then b5. After ab5 there is this move, so it cannot be played. After if at all this, then there is b6. So after a5, if at all after rook e8, so all this because of the rook e8 exchange. So black here we saw a5 move by black, and what happens, and now so black goes g5 in the game, and after g3 now g takes f4, g takes f4, a6, now knights to c3, a rook to g8. Black decides to leave the rooks on the board, which is in fact his best chance. Now a4, rook g4, rook f2. Now the white rook fulfills the task of safeguarding the king side. Meanwhile, the remaining white forces carry out the winning plan on the opposite wing. Now bishop to e6, and there is an interesting winning continuation here. Black, instead of bishop e6, bishop to e8. Now b5, ab5, and ab5, cb5, and there is knight takes d5, king to e6, and rook to e2 check, king f7, rook takes there is rook takes rook takes e8, and after king takes e8 there is a fork here. So it will be winning for white. If at all this, then after bishop e6, safeguarding the d5 pawn. After bishop e6, then after b5, the breakthrough which has been impending for some time. Now after ab5, cb5, knight takes b5, rook g1, knight c3, now king f7, here after rook b2, rook f1, knight to e2, here king e5, then rook e1 check, then knight to e2, here king must not go, king to d6, because there is d4 move. So but the game actually, the knight went to e2, now rook e1, now king e5, now d4, giving up the pawn is black's best chance here. Because after king to e7 there is c6, and after d4 there is rook b7 check, after king to d8 there is king d6, and after rook takes e2 there is rook b8 check, and after bishop c8 there is this c7 check. So black must give up the pawn. After king takes d4, and the rest is just a matter of technique. So the game is decided. Okay guys, I hope this game would have been very illustrative. It's quite a long game, it's a long video, I know. I'll be meeting you in the next game. Thank you all.